There is a rule in the Ashgrove pack that no one writes down because no one needs to. Brides are not traded twice. Once a father sells a daughter to settle a debt, the matter is closed, the coin is spent, and the girl belongs to whoever holds the paper. No one in Ashgrove had ever heard of a bride being sold a second time. Not until the winter, the Alpha King of the Northern Reach sent his men south for a debt Lord Ashgrove could not pay, and the only currency left in the house was a daughter no one wanted to look at. She had worn a veil since she was 12 years old. The scar beneath it did not matter to the story the pack told about her. What mattered was that she was young, that she was unclaimed, and that her father's signature was worth more than her face. What no one in that hall understood, not her father, not the men who came to collect her, not even the girl herself, standing very still in her mother's old traveling cloak, was that the king who would take delivery of that debt did not want a bride at all. He wanted, more than anything else in his long and complicated life, to never have to look another woman in the eye again. This is the story of what happened when he had to. Selene had learned, over 11 years, exactly how to disappear inside a room. She did not learn it from books or from her mother, who had died before she was old enough to teach her anything at all. She learned it from necessity, the way a person learns to walk without knees. When the fire had taken half her face at the age of 6, the pack had not been cruel exactly, not in any way you could point to and name. They simply stopped looking at her, the way people stop looking at a chair they've walked past 1,000 times. Her father, Lord Ashgrove, had been kinder to his hunting dogs than he had been to her in the years since, and she had made her peace with that in the particular way children make peace with things they cannot change, by shrinking herself until there was less of her to hurt. The veil had been her own idea, offered to her by an aunt with more compassion than the rest of the household combined, and she had worn it every day since, not because she was ashamed of the scar itself, but because she had learned that other people's discomfort was a weight she was tired of carrying for them. The night the debt collectors came, she was in the kitchen, elbow deep in flour, when she heard her father's voice go thin and reedy in the great hall, the voice he used when he was frightened and trying not to show it. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the doorway, veil already in place out of habit rather than intention, and found 6 wolves in Ashgrove livery, standing in a loose half-circle around her father, and a 7th man standing slightly apart from them, hood drawn up against the cold, saying nothing at all. "The debt is 11,000 gold, the lead wolf said, in the flat voice of a man reciting numbers he did not care about. "Lord Ashgrove has had 4 years and 3 extensions. The king's patience is not infinite." "I don't have it," her father said, and Selene watched him do the thing he always did when he was cornered, reach for whatever was nearest that he could spend instead of himself. His eyes moved across the hall, past the furniture, past the silver, and landed, with a kind of relief that made her stomach turn on her. "I have a daughter," he said, "unmarried, good hands, quiet, no trouble to anyone. She's yours and the debt is settled." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough that Selene could feel it pressing against her ribs. She did not move. She had known, in some distant part of herself, that this day might come. A girl with no dowry and a ruined face was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay for her, and 11,000 gold was more than she had ever imagined being worth. What she had not expected was how calm she felt, standing there in her flour-dusted apron, watching her own life get sold like a length of cloth. Perhaps calm was the wrong word. Perhaps it was simply that she had spent so many years learning to feel nothing in front of an audience that there was nothing left to feel when it finally mattered. The hooded man at the back of the group finally spoke, and his voice was low enough that it seemed to move through the floor rather than the air. "Bring her forward." She walked to the center of the hall because there was nothing else to do, because 11 years of practice had taught her that stillness was a kind of armor and defiance was a luxury she had never been able to afford. When she stopped in front of him, close enough now to see that his hood cast his face in near total shadow, she lifted her chin, not out of pride, but because, looking at the floor, felt suddenly like something she refused to give him. "Take off the veil," he said. "No," she said, and the word surprised her as much as it surprised the room. Behind her, she heard her father's sharp intake of breath. The hooded man was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, "Fine." He turned to the lead wolf. "The debt is settled. She comes with us tonight." Her father did not embrace her, did not apologize, did not do anything at all except exhale, long and slow, the sound of a man who has just set down a weight he has carried too long. Selene understood, in that moment, with a clarity that would stay with her for years, that she had never truly belonged to this house. She had only ever been kept in it, the way a person keeps something they intend to sell eventually. She gathered nothing. There was nothing here worth taking. She followed the wolves out into the snow with her veil still in place and her spine very straight. And if anyone in that hall noticed that her hands were shaking, no one said so. The journey north took 4 days, and in all 4 days the hooded man spoke to her exactly 11 words: an instruction about where to sit in the carriage, a question about whether she was cold, and, on the final morning, as the towers of the northern reach rose black against a bruised winter sky, a single sentence that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the journey: "You will not be harmed here." It was not warmth. It was not even kindness, precisely, but it was the first thing anyone had said to her in 11 years that sounded like it was meant for her, and not for the version of her that other people found easier to manage. The castle of the Northern Reach was carved from black stone and old grief, and Selene understood within an hour of arriving that something in this place was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with her. The wolves who served here moved like people accustomed to holding their breath. Servants spoke in hushed voices and would not meet her eyes. Not, she realized with something like relief, because of her face, but because they did not meet anyone's eyes as a matter of habit. A steward with kind, tired eyes and silver at his temples met her at the gates and introduced himself as Farron, and it was Farron who explained, in the careful voice of a man choosing every word with tweezers, the terms of her new position. "You will serve in the king's private wing," he said. "You will not speak to him unless spoken to. You will not remove your veil in his presence. That much at least you already understand. And you will not, under any circumstance, be in the eastern tower after moonrise." "Why not?" she asked before she could stop herself. Farron's face did something complicated. Not fear, exactly, but a close cousin of it. "That is not a question I can answer. It is one you will understand in time, or you will not need to. Either way, the rule does not change." She accepted it the way she accepted most things now, with a small nod and no argument, because arguments had never once improved her circumstances, and she saw no reason to believe this castle would be the exception. What she did not say, what she barely admitted to herself, was that the terms Farron laid out were, in every practical sense, kinder than the terms she had lived under in her father's house. She would be fed. She would have her own small room with a door that locked from the inside. She would not be looked at, or rather, she would be looked at exactly as much as she chose to allow. Veil in place, invisible on her own terms rather than someone else's. For a girl who had spent 11 years being unwanted, being merely unseen, felt, unexpectedly, like an upgrade. She should have refused. She should have asked more questions, pushed harder against the strangeness of a king who bought a bride and then hid her away like a piece of furniture no one had decided where to put. She didn't. There was, she told herself, nowhere else to go, and no one waiting for her if she went there. It was easier, safer, to simply begin. Her days settled quickly into a rhythm, and within that rhythm she found small pockets of something she had not expected to find in a castle ruled by a hidden curse, a kind of peace. The kitchen staff, once they understood she asked for no special treatment and offered no complaint about the labor, warmed to her in the unhurried way of people who judged others by their hands rather than their faces. An older cook, named Bridget, took a particular liking to her, teaching her the northern way of working dough that differed, but in small, stubborn ways, from everything she'd learned in Ashgrove's kitchens, and filling the long afternoons with a stream of castle gossip that Selene found, despite herself, comforting in its ordinariness. It was through Bridget that she learned the servant's version of the king's curse, softened by years of retelling into something closer to tragedy than horror. A young lord who had loved too fiercely and been punished for it by magic older than the throne he'd inherited. He wasn't always like this, Bridget told her one afternoon, kneading bread with the brisk efficiency of 40 years' practice. Before the curse, before his father's mess of a reign, he was the kind of boy who'd stop his own horse, mid-ride, to move a fallen bird out of the road. 11 years locked away with that kind of tenderness gone to waste is a crime, if you ask me, whatever the law books call it. Selene turned that image over for days afterward, a boy who stopped for fallen birds, buried now under 11 years of necessary distance, and found that it changed the way she looked at him when their paths next crossed, softening some guarded corner of her own heart she had not realized was still braced for disappointment. The atmosphere of the castle settled into her bones in those first days the way cold settles into stone. Slow and total and impossible to shake once it had arrived. Moonlight fell through the high windows of the servants' corridor in long silver bars, and at night, when the halls emptied and the fires burned low, she would sometimes stand at the narrow window of her room and watch the frost spread its pale lace across the glass, one crystal at a time, and think that this, at least, asked nothing of her. The world outside did not care whether she was beautiful or ruined, welcome or merely tolerated. It simply continued, indifferent and vast, and there was a strange comfort in that indifference that she had never found in the company of people. Her first proper duty was small. Carrying trays to the king's private study, leaving them on a side table, and withdrawing before he so much as looked up from whatever papers occupied him. For 6 days this was the entirety of their interaction. She entered, she set down the tray, she left, and he did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him, and she began to suspect that this arrangement, silent, distant, entirely without friction, she was, if she was honest with herself, not unhappy with that shape. It asked nothing of her that she was not already accustomed to giving. On the 7th day, something shifted. She entered his study at the usual hour, tray balanced against her hip, and found him standing at the window rather than seated at his desk, his back to her, shoulders set in a way that suggested a tension she had no context for. She set the tray down as quietly as she could and turned to leave, and it was then, in the space of that turn, that she felt it, a pull. Faint and strange and entirely unlike anything she had ever experienced, like a hand closing gently around something in her chest and tugging once toward him. She froze. Sour want. Behind her, she heard him go very still as well, and she understood, with a jolt of something between fear and disbelief, that he had felt it too. Wait, he said. she did not turn around. Her heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it across the room. "What is your name?" His voice was rougher than she had heard it before, as though the question had cost him something to ask. "Selene," she said to the door, because she did not trust herself to face him. "Selene." He said it like he was testing the shape of it. "Look at me." She turned, slowly, veil still in place, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her want to step backward, except that her feet, inexplicably, did not move. He was younger than she had expected. The hood and the silence had suggested someone ancient and worn, but the man in front of her had the kind of face carved by grief rather than years, dark hair too long for court fashion, eyes the color of storm water, and an expression she could not name because she had never had cause to learn the word for it, something between hunger and terror. "You felt that," he said. "It was not a question." "I don't know what I felt," she said honestly, and it was, she realized even as she said it, the truest sentence she had spoken since arriving at the northern reach. "No," he agreed quiet. "Neither do I, not yet." He turned back to the window before she could see whatever crossed his face next and said in a voice gone carefully flat again, "You may go." She fled. Not because he had frightened her, though he had in a way she couldn't yet articulate, but because something in her chest was still warm from that strange, invisible pull, and she did not know what to do with warmth she had not asked for and could not explain. She did not see him again for 3 days, and in that silence she told herself firmly that she had imagined the whole encounter, that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings had conjured a feeling from nothing, the way a starving person dreams of bread. It was easier to believe that than to believe the alternative, which was that something in her had recognized something in him, unbidden and immediate in a way that had nothing to do with choice. On the 4th night, moonrise found her exactly where she was not supposed to be. It was an accident, or she told herself. It was she had taken a wrong turn on an errand to the linen stores, misjudged a corridor in the dark, and found herself, quite suddenly, at the base of the eastern tower, moonlight pouring down through an open archway above her like something poured from a silver pitcher. She should have turned back immediately. Instead, she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, listening to a sound she could not place, low, pained, half-human, drifting down from above, and before she had decided to move, her feet had already carried her 3 steps up. That was when Ferran found her, breathless from running, his face white with a fear she had not seen on him before. "You cannot be here," he said, gripping her arm with a desperation that startled her. "Selene, please, you have to go back to your room, now." Before, the sound from above changed, became something closer to a roar, low and grinding and full of an agony that made her chest ache in sympathy she couldn't explain. Ferran's grip tightened. "Before what?" she asked. "Before he sees you like this," Ferran said, and pulled her, not ungently, back down the stairs and away, and would not answer another question for the rest of the night, no matter how she asked it. She lay awake long after turning the sound over in her mind and told herself it was none of her business. That whatever the king became after moonrise was his own affair, kept behind rules for reasons she had no right to question. But some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had spent 11 years being told she was too broken to matter, recognized something in that sound that she understood without being able to name it. The particular note of a creature in pain that has learned no one is coming. He summoned her again 3 days later, and this time there was no pretense of a tray to deliver. Ferran simply appeared at her door in the early evening and told her the king wished to see her in the library, and something in his careful tone told her this was different from the silent errands of the past week. She found him seated by the fire this time, not standing at a window with his back turned, and when she entered, he gestured almost awkwardly, as though the courtesy of it did not come naturally to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, "please." She sat, veil in place, hands folded carefully in her lap, and waited. "I owe you an explanation," he said, after a silence long enough that she had begun to wonder if he'd forgotten she was there. "Not the whole of it. I'm not ready to give you the whole of it. But some part. You don't owe me anything," she said. "I'm a debt paid in a different currency, that's all." Something crossed his face at that, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "That's not all," he said, "and I think you know that, or you wouldn't have felt what you felt in my study last week." She said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. "There is a curse on this house," he continued, and his voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man handling something with a very sharp edge. "It was placed on my line 3 generations ago, and it does what curses do. It takes the thing you value most and turns it into the thing you fear. My father valued his strength above all things, so the curse made him weak in the 1 hour that mattered most. I valued," he stopped, started again, "I valued control. So the curse takes it from me every night at moonrise and gives it back at dawn, and in between I am not entirely a man, and I am not entirely safe to be near. And that is why the Eastern Tower is forbidden, and that is why I have not permitted a woman within these walls in 11 years. 11 years, she repeated, and something in the number struck her, the same span of time she had spent behind a veil, as though their two griefs had been keeping matched pace with each other on opposite sides of a wall neither of them knew existed. "The last time I let someone close," he said, and his jaw tightened in a way that told her. This cost him more than the curse itself had. She did not survive it. "I have not made that mistake again. I do not intend to make it now. Which is why you will remain in the Western Wing, and why the pull you felt, whatever it is, and I have my suspicions, changes nothing about the arrangement between us." She should have been afraid. Some rational part of her recognized that fear was the sensible response to being told calmly by the man who owned her debt that closeness to him had once gotten someone killed. But what she felt instead, sitting across the fire from him with her ruined face hidden and her hands very still in her lap, was something closer to recognition, the particular ache of meeting another creature who had also learned that the safest thing to do with the parts of yourself that frighten people is to lock them away and hope no one comes looking. "I understand," she said. And she did. She understood exactly what it was to build a whole life around a rule that existed to protect other people from you. He looked at her for a long moment, storm-colored eyes unreadable in the firelight, and said nothing more, and she rose and left him there, and neither of them mentioned the pull again, though it did not go away. If anything, in the days that followed, it grew. The politics of the Northern Reach, she learned quickly, were not so easily set aside as the personal terror of a curse. 3 days after that first conversation by the fire, she was summoned again. Not to the library this time, but to the outer edge of the council chamber, where Ferran positioned her behind a carved screen with strict instructions to remain silent and unseen, and where she watched through the screen's narrow gaps. Oz of 5 gray-bearded lords argued with the king over matters she barely understood and instantly recognized as dangerous. The southern border will not hold another season without the grain tithe from Ashgrove's neighboring holds, one lord was saying, tapping a map spread across the long table. And those holds will not commit without assurance that the debt bride arrangement has been formalized properly. A king who trades for a servant instead of a wife sends a message about how seriously he takes his southern alliances. The girl is not a political instrument, Kellen said, and something in his voice, flat, final, dangerous, made even the boldest of the lords lower his eyes. With respect, Your Grace, everything in this hall is a political instrument, whether you wish it to be or not, the lord pressed. Lady Morwen's family has offered, more than once, to resolve the ambiguity of your unmarried state and secure the Southern Alliance in a single stroke. The longer that offer goes unanswered, the more it looks like weakness, and weakness at our borders is not a luxury this kingdom can afford. Selene, listening from behind the screen, felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the draft coming through the chamber's high windows. She had known in an abstract way that her presence in the castle complicated things, but she had not understood until that moment how directly her existence sat athwart the ambitions of Lady Morwen's family, or how thin the ice beneath her position truly was. A debt bride kept quietly in the western wing was one thing. A debt bride the king seemed increasingly unwilling to set aside was quite another, and she understood, watching Kellen's jaw tighten as the council pressed its case, that every gentle evening by the fire was being weighed. Somewhere in this castle, against the cold arithmetic of grain, tithes, and border alliances, I will not be rushed into a betrothal I have refused for 11 years, Kellen said, ending the discussion with the particular finality of a man accustomed to having the last word, and the council, grumbling, dispersed, and Selene slipped away from behind the screen, with her heart still pounding, newly aware that the danger surrounding her in this castle did not begin and end with moonrise. She did not tell him she had overheard. But the conversation stayed with her in the weeks that followed, coloring every gentle exchange with a faint undertone of dread, the sense that whatever warmth was growing between them existed inside a larger machinery that neither of them fully controlled, and that machinery had teeth. Atmospheric anchor. The nights in the northern reach had a particular quality that Selene had not encountered anywhere else. A silence so complete it had texture, broken only by the low groan of old stone settling in somewhere far off, the sound of wind finding its way through towers built for a colder age than this one. Moonlight did not simply fall through the windows here. It pooled, thick as cream, across the flagstones, and on the nights she could not sleep, she would trace its slow crawl across her floor and think that a place built from so much silence must once have held a great deal of noise, and wondered what it had cost the walls to learn to hold their tongues. Their meetings, after that night by the fire, became a habit neither of them named. He would send for her in the evenings, never after moonrise, always before, and she would sit across from him while he read or worked through correspondence, or simply stared into the fire with the particular stillness of a man carrying something heavy enough. He did not touch her. He did not ask her to remove the veil. But he began slowly to talk. First about the kingdom, its politics and its harvests, and the endless negotiations that came with ruling a border territory in uneasy peace with its neighbors, and then, in smaller and more reluctant pieces, about a mother who had died when he was young, about a father whose weakness under the curse had cost the kingdom a war it should have won, about the particular loneliness of being feared by the very people you were sworn to protect. She found herself, without quite intending to, telling him things in return. Not everything, not yet, not the specific shape of the scar beneath her veil, or the specific weight of 11 years of her father's indifference, but true things, offered a little at a time, the way you test ice before trusting your full weight to it. He listened in a way no one in Ashgrove ever had, without flinching, without the polite discomfort she had learned to expect and brace against. Once, when she mentioned, carefully, testing, that she had not been touched with kindness by another person in longer than she could remember, he had gone very quiet, and then said in a voice rough with something she could not name, "Neither have I." And the simple fact of shared loneliness had done more to ease the ache in her chest than any comfort she had been offered before. She hadn't expected that, she thought to herself more than once in those weeks. She hadn't expected any of this. Not the pull, not the conversations, not the strange, careful tenderness of a man who kept himself locked in a tower every night to protect the world from what he became. She hadn't expected to catch herself listening for the sound of his study door, or to feel something loosen in her chest at the particular low rasp of his voice saying her name. She should leave. She should refuse whatever this was becoming. She didn't. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough, a summons after dinner, the usual fire, the usual chair. But when she entered, he was standing rather than seated, and there was a tension in his shoulders that told her something had shifted. "I have a proposal," he said, without preamble. "Not one I make lightly. Go on." "The curse feeds on isolation," he said. "On the absence of anyone close enough to see what I become. I have spent 11 years believing the solution was to remain alone, that solitude was the only mercy I could offer anyone who might otherwise be hurt by what happens after moonrise. But I have begun to wonder if I had that backward. If the isolation is not the cure but the wound itself, what are you asking?" "What are you asking?" "I'm asking," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the first true vulnerability she had heard from him, "whether you would be willing to be in the room. Not close, not touching, but present. In darkness, so that what you see is nothing at all, only what you hear, what you sense. I have never asked this of anyone. I am not certain it is safe. But I find that I would rather risk it than continue as I am." Every instinct she had spent 11 years cultivating told her to refuse. But she thought of the sound she had heard from the base of the eastern tower, the low, pained note of a creature no one had ever come for. And she thought of her own veil and her own years of being handled at a careful distance by people too afraid of what they might see to ever truly look, and she said, before she had fully decided to, yes. The room they chose was windowless, deep in the old part of the castle, and when moonrise came, she sat in absolute darkness on the far side of it, veil still in place, though there was nothing left to hide from in a room with no light at all, and listened to the change happen. It was not what she expected, not violence, not the tearing sound she had half braced for, but something slower and more sorrowful, a low groan of bone reshaping itself, a breath that stretched and roughened into something that was not quite a man's breath anymore. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply sat, present, in the dark, and let him know through her stillness that she had not run. "You're still here," he said, after his voice changed now, lower, rougher, carrying an edge that had not been there before moonrise, but still unmistakably his. "I'm still here," she confirmed. "Say something else," he said, and there was a rawness in the request that undid something in her chest. "I want to hear you. I haven't. No one has stayed in the dark with me before, not since before the curse." So she talked. She told him, in the safety of a darkness that hid them both equally, about her mother, dead too young to remember properly, and about the fire that had taken half her face at 6 years old and half her father's regard along with it, and about 11 years of learning to be smaller so there was less of her left to reject. She told him things she had never told anyone, because the dark made honesty cheap in a way that light never had, and somewhere in the telling she realized that his breathing, rough, strange, not quite human, had gone very still and very close, though he had not moved from the far side of the room, as though he were listening with his whole body. "Cold over cruelty," she said at last, into the dark, not entirely sure why the thought had surfaced. "That's the choice I always made, growing up. Cold over cruelty. Being ignored hurt less than being seen and mocked. I think that's why I've never minded the distance you keep. I understand it. I've built the same wall, just made of different stone." There was a long silence. And then, in a voice gone hoarse with something that might have been wonder, "I don't want distance from you." He said it slowly, as though testing whether the words would hold his weight once spoken aloud, and finding, to his own evident surprise, that they did. She did not know what to say to that. She did not have to say anything because moonlight was already beginning to fade toward dawn, and the low groan of reshaping bone began again, and by the time the door's small window showed gray instead of black, the voice that spoke her name was his own again, human and quiet and utterly wrung out. "Selene," he said, "thank you for staying." "I wanted to," she said, and understood, with a small shock, that it was entirely true. Atmospheric anger. Dawn in the northern reach came slow and pale, gray light spreading across the frost-laced windows like something poured with great care. And in the stillness of that particular morning, Selene stood in the corridor outside the windowless room and pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall, feeling her own pulse settle. Feeling something in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, but suspected, with a kind of quiet dread, she was beginning to understand. He visited her differently after that. Not summons anymore, not the formal language of king and servant, but something gentler, a knock at her door in the evenings, an invitation rather than a command, and she found herself, more nights than not, saying yes before he had finished asking. He told her his name, not the title, not the Alpha King, but the name his mother had used, Kellen, and asked her to use it when they were alone. And the intimacy of that request settled into her like warmth returning to a limb gone numb from cold. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told her one evening. Weeks into this new rhythm, the two of them seated close enough by the fire, now that she could feel its heat on her hands even through the veil's edge. "About being smaller. About learning there is less of you to reject." "It's not a very interesting thing to think about," she said, a little embarrassed. "It's the only interesting thing I think about," he said, quiet and direct in a way that made her breath catch. "I have spent 11 years being the largest, most dangerous thing in every room I enter. A king, a curse bearer, something people fear before they've even met me. You have spent 11 years trying to be small enough not to be noticed. I don't know which of us has the harder wound. I only know that when I'm with you, I don't feel like either version of myself. I just feel like a man sitting by a fire, talking to someone who isn't afraid of him." "I am a little afraid of you," she admitted. "Good," he said, and there was the ghost of something like humor in it. "I'd worry if you weren't. I'm afraid of me too, most nights." She found herself, in that moment, wanting, dangerously, foolishly, to reach across the space between them and take his hand, and the wanting itself frightened her more than anything he had told her about the curse. She was in danger of feeling too much, she thought, watching the firelight move across his face, in danger of wanting things she had spent a lifetime training herself not to want, because wanting things that were not given to you was its own particular kind of pain, and she had had quite enough pain for one life already. He noticed, she could tell, from the way his gaze moved to her hands, still folded carefully, in her lap, and then back to her face, or what he could see of it, veil and all. "You can want things," he said quietly. "You're allowed to. I know that's not how you were raised to think. but it's true." She did not answer, because she did not trust her voice, and he did not push, and they sat together in the particular silence of two people who have said more than they meant to and are both, in their own ways, glad of it. There were other evenings like that one, in the weeks that followed, each adding some small new brick to the structure being built quietly between them. He began, without either of them naming the habit, to walk with her through the castle's older wings after their fireside conversations ended, not out of necessity since her rooms required no escort, but because neither of them seemed willing to let the evening end the moment they stood. He showed her the portrait gallery, where generations of his family stared down from tarnished frames, and told her, with a wry twist to his mouth, which ancestors had been kind rulers and which had been merely competent ones, and which his own father, mostly, had been neither. He showed her the old armory unused, since a piece 2 generations deep had made most of its contents ornamental, and let her run her fingers along a sword that had belonged, he said, to the great-grandmother who had first held this territory against invaders from the ice-locked north. "You know this castle better than anyone who's ever actually lived here," she told him one evening, only half teasing. "I've had a great deal of time to memorize its corners," he said. 11 years leaves a man with very few places left to explore except the ones he already knows. Something in his voice, saying it, carried the particular ache of a life lived mostly alone. And she understood with a small pang that showing her these rooms was not idle courtesy, but something closer to an offering, the only wealth a lonely king had left to share. She began in turn to tell him about Ashgrove, not the version she had told the first time, careful and edited, but the fuller truth of it, the specific cruelty of being seated at the far end of the table, so guests would not have to look at her during meals. The particular humiliation of a suitor once brought to the estate who had taken one look beneath her veil at her father's insistence and left before the evening meal was served. Kellen listened to all of it with a stillness that had by now become familiar to her, not the stillness of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the stillness of a man actually receiving what was being given him. "Your father sounds like a small man wearing a large title," Kellen said, when she finished, and there was enough quiet fury in it that she found herself unexpectedly laughing. A real laugh, surprised out of her, the first one she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit. "That's a very diplomatic way to put it," she said. "I am not feeling diplomatic," he said. "I am feeling that if your father ever sets foot in my hall again, the debt he owes will be recalculated in terms he finds considerably less comfortable than gold." "You defend my honor against my own father," she said, something warm and disbelieving blooming in her chest. "I would defend you against anyone," he said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. And she had to look away, because the warmth in her chest had become, without her permission, something perilously close to tears. The peace did not last. It never does in stories like this one. And Selene should have known, some old tired part of her did know, that a happiness this unearned would come with a cost attached. The cost arrived on a gray morning in the shape of a woman she had never met, sweeping into the castle's great hall with an entourage of 6 and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Lady Morwyn," Farron murmured to Selene, ashen-faced, as they watched from the servants' corridor. "The king's betrothed, before the curse took his father's throne early, her family has never accepted that the arrangement lapsed. She has been trying to reclaim the contract for years." He paused, and something in his face made Selene's stomach turn cold. "She is not a woman who loses gracefully." Selene watched Morwen move through the great hall with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life doubted her own welcome in a room, greeting lords by name, laughing at jokes with a practiced, musical lightness, every gesture calibrated for an audience she assumed was already hers. It was, Selene thought, a kind of performance she recognized, without ever having learned to give it herself. The performance of belonging, worn as easily as some people wore a favorite coat. She understood, watching it, exactly how outmatched she would be in any contest fought on Morwen's chosen ground, and resolved, with a familiar old caution, to avoid that ground entirely if she could. She could not, in the end. Morwen found her in the linen stores that same afternoon, cornering her with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to intimidating servants, and did not bother with pleasantries. "I know what you are," Morwen said, circling her slowly, eyes moving over the veil with an expression of undisguised distaste. "A debt, dressed up and kept in the western wing, like a pet the king is too soft to send back. Do you imagine he means anything by his attention? Men like Kellen are kind to broken things the way they're kind to wounded dogs. Out of guilt, not love. It passes." "I've imagined nothing," Selene said, though her voice was not as steady as she wanted it. "Good," Morwen said, "because I intend to have my contract honored, and I will not have some scarred serving girl standing in the way of 11 years of patience. You should leave quietly before I make your departure considerably less pleasant than it needs to be." Selene said nothing more, and Morwen, apparently satisfied, swept away in a rustle of expensive silk, and it was only once she was alone again that Selene allowed her hands to shake. She did not tell Kellen. She told herself this was practicality, that a king with a curse and a kingdom to manage did not need to be burdened with the petty cruelties of a jealous noblewoman. But the truth, if she was honest with herself, was smaller and more frightened than that. She was afraid that if she gave voice to Morwen's words, some part of her would recognize their truth, that his kindness toward her was pity dressed in gentler clothes, that she had mistaken the ordinary decency of not being cruel to a servant for something it had never actually been. Morwen was not satisfied with a single warning. Over the following days, small cruelties accumulated. A torn hem discovered and blamed on Selene's carelessness, whispered accusations of theft that reached the other servants' ears before they reached her own, a deliberately spilled ink pot on correspondence Selene had been trusted to deliver, engineered to make her appear careless with the king's business. Each incident was small enough to dismiss individually and cumulative enough together, to make the ground beneath Selene's feet feel less solid with every passing day. She said nothing to Kellen. She simply endured, the way she had always endured, learning the shape of this fresh cruelty, the way she had once learned the shape of her father's indifference, quietly, alone, without complaint. Morwen, for her part, did not confine her campaign to Selene alone. Ferran came to Selene one evening, his careful composure cracking at the edges, to report that Morwen had spent the better part of an afternoon in private conversation with 3 of the border lords who had pressed so hard for the betrothal in council, reminding them, in the sort of language designed to sound like concern, that a king distracted by an unsuitable attachment was a king whose judgment on matters of state could no longer be entirely trusted. She had begun subtly to plant the idea that Selene's presence was not merely inconvenient, but actively dangerous. That a debt bride with no title and no family standing had somehow bewitched a king already burdened with a curse. One way or another. "She is building a case," Ferran told Selene grimly, "not just against your position here, but against your safety. I do not think she intends to stop at whispers, if whispers fail her." Selene absorbed this, the way she absorbed most warnings now, with a calm that concealed, rather than reflected, the fear underneath it, and resolved to say nothing to Kellen, both because she did not want to distract him from the genuine burdens of his rule, and because some old stubborn part of her still believed, despite everything he had shown her, that she was not worth the trouble of defending. It was a belief 11 years in the making, and it would take more than a few tender evenings by the fire to fully dislodge it. The breaking point came on the night of the full moon, when Morwen's schemes finally moved from small cruelties to something far more dangerous. Selene had gone, against every rule she had been given, to the base of the eastern tower, not to intrude, but because she had promised Kellen she would be there in the dark room, present as she had been every full moon since the first time, and something had delayed her, a task assigned at the last moment by a steward she did not recognize, sending her the long way through unfamiliar corridors that left her, disastrously, still in the halls when moonrise came. She heard the change happen from 3 floors below, the low groan of reshaping bone, the roar of pain that followed, and this time, without her presence in the dark room to anchor him, it did not stop. It grew wild and directionless, the sound of something in agony with nowhere to put the pain, and Selene, heart in her throat, understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Morwen's assignment had been designed for exactly this outcome. To keep her away on the one night her presence had become, without either of them quite naming it, necessary. She ran, far up the tower stairs, past a horrified Farron who tried and failed to stop her, into the darkness of the room where Kellen, not quite Kellen, the moonlit thing he became, was pacing in agony, dangerous and unmoored, and more lost than she had ever heard him. "I'm here," she said, into the dark, breathless from running. "I'm sorry. I'm late. I'm here now." The pacing stopped, a long, shuddering breath. "Selene." "I'm here," she said again, and stepped further into the room, and felt rather than saw him go still. "You shouldn't be this close," he said, voice rough and strange and full of a fear that was, she realized, entirely for her rather than for himself. "I could hurt you. Tonight especially, something's wrong, I don't know why, the pain is worse than it's ever. I'm not leaving," she said, cold over cruelty. "I choose this. I choose you, in the dark, in whatever shape the curse has left you tonight. I am not afraid of you." And this was the moment, though neither of them named it yet, when something in the room's darkness shifted, some old and patient magic recognizing, at last, the particular shape of a devotion that did not flinch. The agony in his breathing began, slowly, to ease, not because the curse had broken, not yet, but because, for the first time in 11 years, the loneliness at its center had been met with someone willing to stay. She was in danger of loving him, Selene thought, standing in that dark room, with her heart hammering and her scarred face hidden behind a veil that had never mattered less than it did in that moment. And she did not care anymore whether that was wise. It was in the small hours after moonset, Kellen restored to himself and utterly exhausted, that Farron found them both and delivered the news that shattered whatever fragile peace the night had bought them. Lady Morwen had been seen near the tower entrance shortly before moonrise. And a steward, the same steward who had sent Selene on her fatal errand, had confessed, under Farron's questioning, to acting on Morwen's direct instruction. "She meant to leave you alone with him tonight," Farron said grimly, "on the theory that an unwitnessed accident would solve her problem rather more permanently than gossip ever could. If you had been even a few minutes later." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Kellen's face, when he understood the full shape of what had nearly happened, went a color Selene had not seen on him before. Not fear, but a fury, so controlled it was almost worse. "She will answer for this," he said, low and final. "Tonight." But before the confrontation could happen, before Morwen could be summoned and made to answer for her schemes, Selene understood, with a clarity that settled over her like cold water, that there was something she needed to do first, something that mattered more than watching Morwen face consequences, something that had been building in her since the night in the dark room when she had chosen to stay. "Wait," she said, and Kellen turned to her, question in his storm-colored eyes. "Before you deal with her, there's something I need you to see." She reached up, hands steadier than she expected, and untied the veil. The scar ran from her temple to the corner of her jaw, old and pale and permanent, the legacy of a fire that had taken her mother's life along with half her own face when she was 6 years old. She had spent 11 years believing this was the ugliest thing about her, the thing that had made her unlovable, the reason her own father had been able to trade her away like furniture without a second thought. She let him see all of it, in the gray light of a hallway, with no kindness in its shadows, to soften the reveal, because she understood, finally, that hiding it from him had become its own kind of lie, and she did not want to build whatever this was between them on a foundation of things left unseen. Kellen looked at her. Really looked, for the first time, his eyes moving slowly across the scar with an attention that held nothing of pity, and everything of simple, careful seeing. And then he reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and pressed his palm gently to her cheek, thumb resting just at the edge of the old scar tissue. "Mine," he said. "Quiet, certain, not a question." She hadn't expected that, Selene thought again, and this time the words carried no sorrow at all, only a warmth blooming so fiercely in her chest that she thought it might undo her entirely. "Tell me about the fire," he said, gently, his palm still warm against her cheek. "Not the version you told me in the dark, the whole of it, if you're willing, now that there's nothing left between us to hide behind." So she told him. The smell of smoke that still, on certain cold nights, returned to her without warning. Her mother's voice calling her name through a hallway already thick with black air. The particular helplessness of being 6 years old and small enough to be carried out a window by a servant who had not been quick enough to save anyone else. She told him about waking in a healer's care, with half her face bound in linen, and being informed, by an aunt too gentle to soften the truth much further, that her mother had not survived, and that the scar would not either fade or vanish, and that she should prepare herself for a different kind of life than the one she might otherwise have expected. She told him about the years that followed, her father's slow withdrawal, not cruel in any single dramatic gesture, but cruel in its accumulation, 1,000 small absences where warmth should have been. And by the time she finished, her voice had gone thin and her eyes were wet in a way she made no effort to hide. Cledden did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her the scar was beautiful or that she should not mourn what the fire had taken, both of which she had heard before from people who meant well and understood nothing. Instead, he simply drew her against him, careful and unhurried, and held her while she cried the particular tears of someone finally permitted to grieve a loss she had spent 11 years being told to minimize. "I am sorry," he said into her hair, "that no one gave you room for this sooner. You're giving me room now," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "That's not nothing." "It should have happened long before now," he said. "But I intend to make up for lost time, if you'll let me." They stayed like that for a long while, the two of them wrapped together in the gray hallway light, neither of them in any hurry to move toward the confrontation that still waited elsewhere in the castle. There would be time enough, soon, for consequence and reckoning, for Morwen's schemes to be laid bare before the court, for the border lords to recalculate their calculations. But for these few quiet minutes, Selene allowed herself something she had rarely permitted in 11 years, to simply be held without bracing for the moment. The arms around her would inevitably withdraw. They didn't withdraw. Kellen's hold only tightened, steady and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to spend a good deal of it exactly here. What followed happened quickly, the way consequences often do once the truth has finally been spoken aloud. Morwen was summoned before the full court the following morning, her steward's confession laid bare, her scheme exposed not by Kellen's authority, but by Selene's own quiet insistence on testifying to what had happened, the delayed errand, the near tragedy in the tower, the pattern of small cruelties that had, in retrospect, been building toward exactly this outcome. Morwen's family, informed of the attempted murder of a servant under their daughter's instruction, moved with the swift self-preservation of nobility, protecting its own reputation, withdrawing their support and their claim to the lapsed betrothal contract in the same breath. Morwen left the northern reach in disgrace before the week was out, and if there was any justice at all in the manner of her leaving, it was small and quiet and entirely beside the point of what mattered now. The border lords who had once pressed so hard for a formalized betrothal found themselves, in the weeks that followed, considerably less eager to press the matter at all, not because the political calculus of grain tides and southern alliances had changed, but because a king who had faced down an assassination attempt on the woman he loved, and emerged from it more resolute rather than less, was not a man easily maneuvered by council pressure. Selene attended the following session from behind no screen at all, seated openly at Kellen's side, and watched the same lord who had once called her a political inconvenience choose his words with considerably more care than he had before. What mattered now was the curse, and the curse, Selene would learn in the weeks that followed, required one final thing before it would release its hold entirely. Not merely a witness in the dark, not merely honesty freely given, but a choice made in full light, with nothing hidden on either side. The curse takes the thing you value most and turns it into the thing you fear, Kellen told her, the two of them standing together at the same window where she had first felt pull between them, sunlight now instead of firelight. I valued control. It took my humanity one night in every month and made me afraid of my own hands, but I think I have come to believe that the breaking condition was never really about control at all. I think it was about being seen, and choosing to stay seen, by someone who had every reason to look away and chose not to. And your part in it? She asked. Already given, he said, and your part in it. See. The night you stayed in the dark with me and told me the truth about your mother, about the fire, about 11 years of making yourself small. You gave the thing you'd been protecting longest. I only had to receive it without flinching. He paused, and something vulnerable crossed his face. I love you, Selene. Not the version of you the veil could hide, and not the version of me that only exists by daylight. All of it. I want all of it, if you'll have me. She had spent 11 years learning that wanting things led only to disappointment, that hope was a debt collected cruelly by a world that did not care for broken girls with ruined faces. But standing in that sunlit window, veil long since abandoned, scar bare to the morning light and to the eyes of a man who had looked at it and called it his, she found that she did not believe that old lesson anymore. 11 years of bracing for absence had not prepared her for a presence this steady, this unwilling to look away, and she understood in that window that unlearning an old fear could happen all at once in a single sunlit morning if the right person simply refused to leave. Yes, she said, I choose you. I have already chosen you. every night I stayed in that dark room. I'm only saying it in the light now, so there's no mistaking it. That night, at moonrise, for the first time in 11 years, the change did not come at all. The seasons turned as seasons do, and the northern reach that had once been a place of silence and averted eyes became, slowly, something warmer, a castle where servants no longer moved like people holding their breath, where the eastern tower stood open and unremarkable, its old purpose rendered obsolete by a curse finally. Selene walked its halls now, without her veil more often than with it, not because the scar had disappeared, but because she had stopped believing it needed hiding, and the pack that had once flinched from difference learned, gradually, to simply see her a queen, scarred and unafraid, who had chosen a king no one else had been brave enough to stay for. Word of what had happened at the northern reach traveled, as such things do, well beyond its borders. Not the political details of broken betrothals and border alliances, but the simpler, stranger story of a king who had been cursed to lose himself every month for 11 years. And a debt bride who had sat with him in the dark until the curse could find nothing left to feed on. Selene received, in the months that followed, letters from places she had never been, from a woman in a distant hold, who had spent her own childhood hidden away for a birthmark she'd been taught to be ashamed of, from a mother whose son bore burn scars from a kitchen accident, and who wanted to know how to help him believe he was still worth loving. Selene answered every letter herself, in her own hand, because she understood better than almost anyone what it meant to receive proof that someone, somewhere, had survived the same particular loneliness and come out the other side of it whole. She wrote to her father exactly once, a short letter informing him that the debt was considered paid in full and that she did not expect, nor particularly want, further correspondence between them. Hey? He did not reply, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that his silence caused her very little grief. She had spent 11 years hoping for a warmth from him that had never come. She had at last stopped waiting for it, and the space that hope had once occupied had been filled, instead with something considerably more solid. A household full of people who had learned slowly and then all at once to see her plainly and find nothing in the seeing that required apology. Nearly a year after the night in the dark room, on an evening thick with the particular gold light of early autumn, Callan found her in the library, where it had all begun, and settled into the chair across from hers with the easy familiarity of a man who no longer needed formality to close the distance between them. The library itself had changed in small ways over the months, new candles replacing the old guttering stubs, a second chair drawn permanently close to the first, a scattering of her own books, mixed now among his on the long shelves, as though the room itself had quietly accepted that it belonged to two people rather than one. "Do you remember," he said, "the first thing I ever asked you? Take off the veil," she said, smiling despite herself. "I said no, you did," he agreed. It was the first time in 11 years anyone had told me no and meant it, and I think some part of me fell in love with you right then, though it took the rest of me considerably longer to catch up. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the unhurried confidence of something claimed and kept. "I'm glad you said no that night. I'm glad you made me wait until you were ready to be seen. I'm glad you waited," she said, and meant it entirely. He was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past year as the particular softness he reserved only for her, the look of a man still faintly amazed, after everything, that this was his life now. "Farron tells me the healers in the southern hold have made progress with scar treatments," he said carefully. "If you ever wanted, not because you should, Not because anyone here thinks you need to change anything about yourself, but only if you wanted it for you. No, she said, gently but firmly, and watched him nod, unsurprised, already understanding. I've spent 11 years being told this was the worst thing about me. I'd like for once to keep it exactly as it is, and let it mean something else instead. What would you like it to mean? He asked. She considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she turned over most things now, slowly, without the old reflex to shrink from her own answer. That I survived something, she said finally. That I was loved before the scar, briefly, by a mother who didn't live to keep loving me. And that I am loved after it, now, by someone who never once needed me to hide. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and reverent, the gesture of a man who had learned, over a long and difficult year, exactly how much weight a single small tenderness could carry when it was offered without condition. Then that is what it will mean, he said. For as long as either of us is alive to say so. Outside, the last of the autumn light was fading gold to violet across the black stone towers of the northern reach, and somewhere below, the sounds of a castle no longer afraid of itself drifted up through the evening, laughter, the ordinary business of a home rather than a fortress, the particular music of a place that had finally, after 11 long years, stopped holding its breath. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoy these stories and would like to support the channel and get access to exclusive content I share there, you can find me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Let me know what you thought. I always read your comments, and they mean more than you know.